Welcome in, everyone. Good evening. My name is Abayo Chamika Tisdale, and I'm the programming assistant at Charis Circle, the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books and More, which is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Tonight, we are so excited to be joined by Becky Thompson to celebrate This Unruly Witness, June Jordan's Legacy, a collection of bold and tender writing on June Jordan's multidimensional legacy as a poet, healer, and activist. Tonight, Becky will be in conversation with Maya Marshall. Maya is the poetry director and an editor at Haymarket Books. She publishes compelling, accessible poetry by writers who are committed to a political, cultural, and arts ethic. A poet and writer, Maya is the author of All the Blood Involved in Love and a co founder of Underbelly. Marshall has earned fellowships from MacDowell and Cave Canem, among others. Her poems and essays are featured in numerous publications, including Prose to the People and American Poetry Review. Marshall lives in Decatur, Georgia. Becky Thompson. Becky Thompson is a poet, scholar, yogi, activist, and co editor of This Unruly Witness. Her other books include Teaching with Tenderness, To Speak in Salt, Zero is the Hole I Fall Into at Night, and two edited poetry volumes. Becky teaches social justice and creative writing at Simmons University in Boston. In the wee hours, she writes music and plays the electric guitar. a couple of a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. There will be time for a Q&A after their conversation, so please keep your questions in mind. And for folks joining us virtually, leave them in the chat and I will read them out when we get to that portion of the evening. Buying your books from Charis directly supports our work and allows us to keep putting on free events like this. So for folks in person, we've got books up front available for purchase, and for folks online, you can click the teal button at the bottom of your screen to order This Unruly Witness from our website. Before I pass it over to Maya and Becky, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who wrote the foreword for this collection, sent over a short welcome that I'm going to play to get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Alexis Pauline Gumbs. I am so grateful that you are inside of this love reunion in honor of June Jordan. In the preface to this exciting collection, I just took the opportunity to remind us all that in 1977, June Jordan taught us that love is life force. And it's what I'm drawing on as I remember that love is what moves us forward, love is what moves us toward each other, and love is what allows us to make the decisions that risk our freedom. I'm going to give you a reading recommendation, which I always do. I would say look to June Jordan's poem of commitment for this time. And it's a poem where she talks about what it means to love the children of our communities and what it means to be prepared to put our bodies between those children and the violence that seeks to take them away from us and their childhoods away from them. So it's a celebration, but June Jordan's love and celebration also always comes with an assignment. I know that this gathering is going to be fortifying and nourishing and emboldening for all of you who are gathered there and all of you who are gathered online. And I'm sending my love, my gratitude, my life force to be with you. Okay, bye.
All right.
What a gift.
What a beautiful gift, yes.
Yeah, I think I'm prepared to keep in mind what our assignment will be when we leave here. So maybe that's where we'll land. But to start, I'll say, Becky, thank you for sending this book to Haymarket. You sent this proposal maybe 2.5, 3 years ago. I don't know if people understand just how glacial the process of publishing a book is, but it takes some doing. And you did so even though you had the option of being in an academic press. I wonder if you'd speak just a little bit to why it is you chose Haymarket as the book's home.
Really, it was Barbara Ransby, one of the founders of the Black Radical Congress and such a leader in terms of social justice and anti-racist work. And I was meeting with her and Diane Hereford at NWSA, National Women's Studies Association, and started to tell her about the trials and tribulations of this book. And she said, "Oh, I'll make a call for you." And that's how we got to you. And that there was also some bumps with that, but once the book found its way to you, it became um, this glorious connection, the synergism of your understandings of June's work and my own connection to it. Really, we brought it all together. And I think we made magic in terms of what we had to do, because when it got to Haymarket, as you're saying about publishing, it was 30,000 words over. That's gargantuan, and it had a different structure because of the academic piece. It just looked different in that way, and you had the editor's vision to know how to shape it so that the way that Lauren had originally conceived of it and the way that I think June might have wanted it to be came out. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that credit you're giving to me. I will say that I'm generally led by an interest in making sure that whatever I put into the world is of use, of accessible and easy and challenging use to the people who receive it. And from what I continue to hear about June from the many, many people in this book, I don't know, maybe 50 people in this book, she was a force. She was a person invested in fortitude as much as she was invested in joy and rigor. And my role at Haymarket is very much in the literary space, though Haymarket's primary work is political and economic nonfiction that's invested in labor justice and social justice. So I live in that sliver of the Venn diagram where those two things overlap. And I think that that June did her work from that space. Pedagogically, she was invested in the words of the human beings on the ground much more than any institution. And I get the sense that she never walked into any room as part of herself rather than the whole thing. I get the sense from you that you are also insistent on a rigorous love, and that you are firmly and lovingly demanding of anyone who decides to take on labor with you as a collaborator. So I would love to hear you speak about Lauren, who sort of handed off the baton to you in the practice of making this book, and how you came into this project and how this book came to be.
So there's more than one origin story with any book, right? But one of the origin stories is that Lauren, who was hand chosen by June to edit the Revolutionary Blueprint, the Poetry for the People, had organized two panels. One was the National Women's Studies Association, and one was the American Studies Association, that happened simultaneously. So there were 8 different people delivering these papers. I think it was 2019. And I was one of the people on one of the panels. And as I heard the caliber of the papers, I was, oh my. And I looked over, and there was a phone, and one of the people on the panel was taping our presentations because Lauren was in the hospital getting a chemo treatment in San Francisco. So that helped me to know the urgency of getting the work out, and that also that even then we were starting to see that project was part of what was keeping Lauren alive. So she early on had a long list of people that she wanted to invite because she had been part of Poetry for the People and had been a beloved, member of the City College of San Francisco for a lot of years, which also had a Poetry for the People project. So all of those connections together meant that between the 8 people that were on those panels and a lot of other people she knew, we had a long list. And then there were people from my life, from the edited books I've done before, and from my own activism. So yeah, it was a generative project from the very beginning. And to just full circle that, when Lauren was in the hospital, which turned out to be the last time, and we didn't know it was the last time, the only thing she took with her was the manuscript, which was hefty at that point, right? And her sisters were, "What are you doing? Why, But she was hell bent on continuing to work. And the last substantive conversation she had was with me on the phone, which I didn't know at the time, about it. And she said, call Cornelius Eady. He wants to be part of it, and be sure to connect with Joy Harjo. And then the next day is when she traveled on. And that's 2 things that were the 2 poems that she wanted to hear before she traveled were both June poems. One is called In Flight, and the other one is poem about my rights. So, and Lauren died in the same hospital where she would go with June sometimes when June was getting chemo treatments. So there's so much. And so early on, I started to get that when June traveled to the next realm, she threw out 1,000 batons. Mm-hmm. And some of my interest was who got those batons? Because you might not even know you got one, nor did you necessarily ask, but then you find yourself with it. And I think that raises an interesting question about when you are being directed by people who are in a different realm, what kind of responsibilities do you have, and how do you communicate? And that's what I think we're seeing with many of the essays. There's a sense, a spiritual depth in many of the essays that I think comes from that carrying of the baton. Yeah,
I think that's absolutely right, and I think the sort of carrying of the baton or being led to do continued work from ancestors is one way to define what legacy means. Mm-hmm. It is not only the noun of like what you left behind, it is also it's the action you inspire. And to me, that's the sort of spine of this book. Mm-hmm. Each one of the people here has taken up the charge that June has left, which is to tell the truth and make it useful for those of us who are fighting for freedom. Maybe that's the most simplified way I can say what's in this book. But because you've brought in this awareness of the spirit realm outside of the current plane, I'd like to invite in a little bit more of Alexis Pauline Gumbs and start with her foreword. It picks up actually where she left off in her introduction here with this epigraph from June. The foreword is titled A Definition of Love. It begins with the epigraph. Love is life force. I believe that the creative spirit is nothing less than love made manifest. And it seems to me that love, that a serious and tender concern to respect the nature and the spontaneous purpose of other things, other people, will make manifest a peaceable order among us, such that fear, conflict, competition, waste, and environmental sacrifice will have no place. June Jordan, from The Creative Spirit, 1977. Amazing how relevant that continues to be.
Incredible, right?
My goodness.
But you also read it beautifully, Maya.
Thank you. Been practicing reading for a long time. It's one of my favorite things. So I will continue. This foreword isn't very long, but I do want to read it to you to welcome you into the book. So if you do decide to grab it online or from Charis, know that you are actively and individually welcomed. This is not a book. It's a reunion made of all the things that we do in the light of June Jordan's loving life of work. Things we must do from the dark of missing her embodied presence. Welcome. In these pages, you will meet or reunite with June Jordan through her impact, her friends, her students, and many of the thinkers, educators, and activists who work and her legacy are here, offering you what June gave us, an opportunity to love ourselves and each other more honestly, an imperative to make love powerful. In the essays and poems that follow, you will learn how June Jordan taught us to love our communities with our words and actions, to love across generations, to love romantically within and beyond the boundaries of marriage, to love ourselves enough to tell the truth of who we are. And isn't that a dangerous thing?
Mm-mm-mm.
To love ourselves when we feel like failures, to love each other when we are very angry. And aren't we all right now? Rightfully. To love it, life itself, where and when it is threatened, and isn't it? By the state, by the desperate. To love across species and oceans, to love across grief, that constant friend. To love the process when we don't know what we are doing, like every day of my life. To love revising poems, to love our students, to love our memories, to change our institutions by loving them. This is not a soft love she's talking about. This is not a thin love she's talking about. I'm sure you hear Toni Morrison here too. To love our communities by leaving institutions behind. We're looking for an assignment, right? To love our laughter, to love our questions, to love our music, to love who we used to be, and who we are becoming, and who we are right now in the midst. And there are openings for love we haven't even imagined yet. I first read Jordan's essay, The Creative Spirit, in a quiet room, sifting through archival boxes, and there it was, her typed and retyped draft of a talk for a conference about children's literature, and there it was, that sentence, love is life force. During my visits to June Jordan's papers at the Schlesinger Library, as I opened folder after folder, I continued to ask myself, what can this letter, manuscript, syllabus, etc., teach me about love? The material artifacts of June's life and the miraculous gift of knowing some of her students, colleagues, and loved ones teaches me about love in a way that never remains merely theoretical. Her theory of love permeates my life. It offers my personal and political relationships back to me to attentively wonder about and revise as if this whole planet were a poetry for the people classroom, where how I love will be reflected back to me again and again, inviting more bravery, more truth, wiser action. Because I study June Jordan, I am becoming a more available friend, a more generous sister, a more passionate partner, a freer teacher, a more committed daughter to my given and chosen mothers. This book, this place, this reunion, though gratefully compiled in memory of June Jordan, is not a backward facing ceremony. It is a futuristic resource toward the possibility of more love flowing through you, you, in all directions. And so, my offering, my humble assignment to you as a belated student teacher of the June Jordan approach, is to ask yourself as you read each essay, poem, or reflection in this book, what can this teach me about love? What can the experience of reading each passage, stanza, and paragraph here teach you about the love growing in your life right now? I am so grateful to be here with you in this printed place of infinite possibility, in this sacred, shaking, possible place where love is life force, and therefore June Jordan lives. Love always, Alexis Pauline Gumbs.
Beautiful.
Isn't she? So I'll ask. And then maybe I'll give context that we probably should have provided sooner. But first, what does teaching teach you about love?
Well, I end up feeling like many of my classes are become love fests. If because I try to choose books that they will fall in love with. I'm thinking about Elizabeth Acevedo's Poet X, which we read out loud and stop every few pages to do free writes. And so many people can bring some piece of themselves to that reading. So, and I'm thinking about Thich Nhat Hanh's The Miracle of Mindfulness, which asks us to be as present as we possibly can be. And if I start the semester with that, to remind us that we are the ones we've been waiting for, right from June Jordan, right? And that being present with each other is how we can actually go deep into the material. That's the love fest piece. And then the standard of excellence, right? Because, the first edited book I did with Sangeeta Tyagi is Beyond a Dream Deferred, Multicultural Education and the Politics of Excellence. Because Africana studies and women's studies and any anti-imperialist work is about that work of excellence, the rigor of that. And I'm thinking too about when we decided to do one of these rituals for the book at the Provincetown library, where all the bookshelves were all around, right? And also doing it here, of course, is to remind us about the elegance and the rigor that can come from rigorous understanding of the books that we read. So it's not about a textbook, it's about 7 books in an intro class. That to me. And then from June Jordan, that the guidelines for how to read and critique a poem that then is used and has been used all over the world. That teaching says, I'm going to ask the most of myself with love, with tenderness, and I'm going to ask that of your poetry as well. And so then I think another thing about teaching for me, because I've had the enormous luck of being able to teach in refugee centers and at China Women's University in Beijing. And what I learned from June Jordan is teaching to the people who are there.
Yeah.
Right. You can come in with all kinds of ideas, but it's really so when I'm paired up with a man who they called a refugee who turned out to be, professor in Afghanistan, who was supposed to be my, teach like my translator. Well, instead we co-teach the course, and then I provide a packet of poems that mostly are from Syria and Afghanistan and Palestine, right? And I put in an Audre Lorde poem and say, which one do you want to start with? And he comes in the next day and he's translated into Farsi. He's translated, A Litany for Survival. That's the teaching is also picking up on the energy of wherever you are and knowing that there's tremendous. So that's about, you don't start with asking people to write and read in English. No, you start with whatever languages people speak in, and that I think comes from June Jordan as well.
I think that's right. I think June was a co-thinker alongside the very famous popular education popularizer Paulo Freire, who is invested in a pedagogy of the oppressed, pedagogy from the people, and they had useful generative disagreements. Because June was not wanting to be limited to a narrow definition of who we should be learning from in the classroom. But I think that they really agreed on identifying a sort of counter to the banking model of education, where it's not one person comes in and knows everything that everyone else gets to receive as a deposit. It is everyone in the room as a teacher. Which I think is a fundamental element of June Jordan's Poetry for the People education model, which, if you do not already know, is a counter model, a model for justice, one that reimagines a canon that is homogenous into one that represents the many. And so it is a counter to the Iowa writers model that came to popularity in the 1930s, which was interested in like a limited group of people talking to themselves. But the Poetry for the People model includes these 4 elements. In a 3-hour day, go into this classroom that anyone is welcome to. It does not have to be a creative writing major. It can be a graduate student. It is anyone in the university is welcome to take this course once it gets started. And the first element is this open mic, followed by small group facilitated conversations with these student teacher poets, wherein maybe a group of 5 people workshop, which is to use those guidelines that June has set out, which says, does it have the vertical rhythm? Is it a poem? Meaning, have you told the truth? Is there music here? And then people offer real feedback, rigorous feedback, and read it again out loud, at least twice, because as I talk about them, poems are sound sculptures, and we are here to connect, which means speaking to one another and looking one another in the eyes. And then the third element to the Poetry for the People model is that a committee outside of this classroom puts together a reading that is free and open to the public. And then the last element is that committee creates a book, a zine, out of the writing that they've created together. That is a replicable, sustainable model that broke a system that was invested in making literature that just replicated a single experience, and invited in a witness and sincerity and honoring of multiple cultures and classes and generations. And those students, the student teacher poets, the students themselves, the people who observed the readings in real time, the folks who read those zines, helped us write this book by testifying to their lived experience with June. That pedagogy led to anthologies that were created. It led to winning book prizes that historically had been exclusively given to white men. It led to like the imminent reprinting of June Jordan's Poetry for the People, a revolutionary blueprint, which will happen next year.
By Haymarket.
By Haymarket Books, yeah, in the fall of 2026. It led to writing careers and bringing in really majorly established poets like the former U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, maybe the only Indigenous U.S. Poet Laureate, into classrooms, because those writers like Cornelius Eady and Alcimia Bashir recognize poetry as a practice that is meant to be public and of service, not exclusive, and invested in more and more prestige. So I find all of that very moving, and I think it is the underlying ethic that holds this book together. So those are the things I think about when I think about what legacy is. You've spoken a little bit about what it means, what June meant as a teacher, and what the process of putting this book together was, and what legacy is. I wonder if you'd speak a little bit more about your own classroom and how this book might be used in it, but then maybe, speak to the range of voices here.
So I'm just struck as you're talking about one of June Jordan's poems that there's about 10 that, I mean, she's got a huge opus, right? But about 10 that people in this book refer to many times. And one of them is called These Poems. Yeah. And I think it connects with what you're talking about. These poems, they are the things that I do in the dark, reaching for you, whoever you are. And are you ready? These words, they are stones in the water, running away. These skeletal lines, their desperate arms for my longing and love. I am a stranger, learning to worship the strangers around me, whoever you are, whoever I might become. So that is an anthem for teaching. It's, I'm going to calm all myself here, and I'm going to try to connect with you in as deep a way as I can. So, and then I'm thinking about, when you talk about legacy, I'm thinking about Marilyn Hacker, who's such a poet in her own right and has translated so many books from Arabic into English and vice versa. She writes, to each nation, its Jews, its Blacks, its Arabs, Palestinians, immigrants, its women, from each nation, its poets, Mahmoud Darwish, Audre Lorde, Neruda, Amichai, Senghor, and you, June Jordan. And then I'm thinking about how there's so many different kinds of love celebrated in this volume, right? It's curated by people who understand the awesome, difficult work of love. June Jordan writes, my life seems to be an increasing revelation of the intimate face of universal struggle. And then about your question, when I first found June Jordan's work, it was on-call political essays, and that essay in particular, Many Rivers to Cross. And I remember being in graduate school, and I was intimidated by the very academic language and the very linear way of thinking and being. And I was really struggling with finding my own voice in that. And when I would be reading Talcott Parsons or Durkheim or who else, right? And I couldn't find my own, I would pick up a June Jordan book, in particular On Call. And there was something about the cadence of her language and the way that her sentences were that would allow something of mine to slip out. So on the margins, I have little tiny pencils, the beginning of the language and the beginning of poetry, right? So I want to also celebrate her essays because they work together in tandem so beautifully. And that the teaching piece of that. And then when I was asked to do one of the eulogies for June after she passed in Boston, and I thought I would write a paragraph, instead a poem came out, which is called A Morning Morning. And it's the first poem I had written in 20 years. I was stunned by that. This was the beginning of my getting about the baton piece. And so then I realized I needed to not only teach her essays, but I needed to teach her poetry, right? And that then got me to Sonia Sanchez, who then said, Becky, what are you going to do to make poetry the very center of your life, right? That was another handoff. So the piece about teaching, I think, is for June was also that she was multilingual, that she could write essays, she could write for the progressive. She was an architect. I mean, there's been 2 architecture schools that have celebrated her work beautifully because of the bigness of her mind, right? Let me rethink how to lay out Harlem so that it's actually people friendly. I mean, that's the kind of big mind that she, I think, also brought to the classroom and to her writing. Yeah.
And to the world. You're speaking about a kind of multiplicity, that a refusal to be limited. I would love to hear Morning Morning if you would like to read it.
Oh, I don't have it with me.
Okay.
But that would have been a great thing to bring.
Well, there will be other opportunities.
Yeah.
And
it's in my first book of poetry called Zero is the Whole I Fall Into at Night. And when I first finished that book, it was HOLE, Zero is the Whole. And by the time I was able to bring it out into the world, it was WHOLE. That speaks to, I think, poetry as a healing process. And a morning morning was the morning that goes into the morning, right? The actual dawn. But both of those things, the birth and death has always connected to each other. Yeah.
Part of the cycle.
Part of the cycle, yes.
So you've named your essay in this book, The Waters Are Wide. We can cross over, I assume, in direct response to the Many Rivers to Cross that you were speaking to. that came from June's journalism. Is there a section you would want to share from this?
Well, yeah, I would. Thank you for asking. I didn't pull it out, but you happen to have the page over there somewhere?
Yeah, you are here, 71 through 79.
Thank you. In these, it's called Tricky Crossings. In these past years, Jordan's water work, her word work, her work as a teacher have been a guide for me, particularly as I've accompanied people in transit from the Middle East and North Africa. In 2015, I found myself at the epicenter of a crisis in Lesbos, Greece, when hundreds and then thousands, and then by the end of the year, 1 million people passed through this tiny island on their way to other countries in Europe. As I became part of a grassroots movement of people greeting rafts of people coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Palestine, and many other countries, I had Jordan's work as a model. Her first lesson: start by listening. Whatever the mainstream media began to say, turn that on its head. What they began to call the refugee crisis was an outrageous example of undemocratic language, since it puts the onus on the refugees rather than on the geopolitical conditions that force people to leave their homes. Refugee crisis is an example of a phrase that is missing the agent of the sentence, which governments are forcing people to risk their lives to try to save their lives. This is not unlike the utterly common phrase, I was raped, that Jordan uses as a powerful example of passive voice in problems of language in a democratic state. Actually, what we have been witnessing is the biggest multilingual, intergenerational, multinational peace march since World War II. From Jordan, I learned if there are many rivers to cross, or in the case of Lesbos, first a perilous sea and then many mountains to cross, get a bicycle and loop people's backpacks on the handlebars. When the NGO leaders are asleep, find the key to the warehouse and liberate the shoes and diapers and warm pants and the band-aids that the said NGO is saving for an emergency. Lay all the supplies out on the beach in rows so children can come by and pick out just the sneakers they want, so no one has to stand in line for clothes that were intended for them to begin with. From Jordan, I learned when the time comes for people to write their stories about their journeys, certainly don't ask them to write them in English. The cadence, rhythms, emotions, and reasons in their stories are in their own languages. There will be time to translate the writing later. First, get it onto the page. Poetry for the People starts with phrases about how people make a way out of no way. It includes funny stories because even in tragedy, there is humor. Yes, the stories include love and tenderness and fighting and hurting and despair and community and connection and audacious behind the scenes and in the front of the police acts of resistance.
Well, thank you for reading that, for giving us yet another assignment to make sure that the things that are being held for an emergency get shared with the people who need them. Yeah, I really appreciate hearing that, and to hear you as another multi hyphenate with a big mind, right? Share how you learned what you've learned and how you pass it on. What I hear in the tricky crossings that you've just shared is another invitation to be aware of just how many are included in a we in community, and that we should not use reductive language like refugee unless it is survey somebody.
I mean, I came to understand that actually a more appropriate word is cosmopolitan. Yeah, because most all the people that I met were multilingual. They had traveled extensively. They had an understanding of what it means to travel together. They had an understanding of geography, right? And they'd lived through that's a cosmopolitan. That's very different than saying the word refugee, right?
Yeah, there might be a little bit of something about class in there.
Cosmopolitan.
Cosmopolitan. A little elevated acknowledgement of a worldliness. We are rounding toward a time where we might invite questions from the room and from the folks online. I would like to ask one more question and maybe marry it with a little excerpt from a compelling interview that you edited here with Angela Davis, Pratibha Parmar, and Lee Rayford. This conversation took place in 2021, 2022. And there's this section where Angela Davis is talking about the sort of desire she had for June to be closer to a capital A activist until it became clear to her how poetry worked in June's life and works in the world for those of us who read poetry as a public service rather than a sort of limited self-reflection. Poetry of witness as a practice for leading to action. So I'm going to read just a little excerpt, and then the question that I'll have for you and for the room, if you're so inclined, is what does poetry have to do with politics? For June, Poetry for the People mobilized a full generation nationwide, globally even, and led educators to dedicate part of their teaching philosophy to spreading this model that allows the people in a classroom and in a juvenile detention center and in a retirement community and in a nursing home to be witness and to be expert in their lived experience and to connect with one another. I think that is political. So here is the excerpt. Angela Davis says, I'm remembering how politically difficult conditions were at that time. This was the Reagan-Bush era. There was the period of consolidation of global capitalism. The welfare state was in the process of declining. The conditions that were unfolding were precisely those that led to what we call mass incarceration in this country. The prison industrial complex was in the process of being erected, and we hadn't figured out how to mount the kind of resistance that would have been required at that time. Let's remember also that this was the period of decline of the socialist community of nations. Capitalism was being represented as triumphant, and we were attempting to find our way, groping, as it were, toward an understanding of the conditions such that we would be able eventually to create solidarity movements. The movement for solidarity with South Africa was very powerful, perhaps the most widespread and obvious mark of solidarity. June was talking about solidarity with Palestine. I can remember June traveled to Lebanon and wrote. She always wrote poetry about everything she did. The big expressions of desire for radical change in the world, as well as the small experiences that she had with her friends. It would be important to reread her work during that period, precisely in order to get some insight about where we were and how we were feeling. Many people were depressed that we had to deal with Ronald Reagan and the Bushes, and maybe, right now, Trump. And we really did not know where we were going. And at that time, there were all these other movements that were emerging that were so important. The environmental movement, climate disaster right now, the women of color, the feminist movement, and the LGBTQ movement right now. The trans, that T is very important, very present. I don't know if anyone else at that period was able to adequately recognize the potential of these movements that were so frequently dismissed as special interests and movements that only involved relatively small but particular sectors of the populations, but certainly had nothing to do with the grand struggle for democracy. June knew precisely of that. If we fully understand why it is so important to struggle for LGBTQ rights, if we know why it was so essential to express solidarity with Palestine and speak out against the Israeli occupation of Palestine, then we will understand what the struggle for radical democracy really was. I find myself returning to that period, remembering how receptive June was and how more of us should have been willing to follow the leadership that she was offering at that time. Leadership she was offering through poetry. But we can do it now because the problems remain. And I'm happy to hear that you have an abolition democracy initiative at UC Berkeley. We were just beginning to try to figure out what those relationships were then. She goes on to say, when we were about to create Critical Resistance, I tried to get June involved with the organizing committee. But that's not what she did. I've learned since that I cannot argue for the same kind of participation on the part of others who can express themselves far more powerfully through their words, through their music, through their poetry. I've learned now that I have to follow them rather than ask them to follow me. Even though she was not directly involved, I can remember many times referring to her poems and her way of grasping that moment. They were, in many ways, a beacon for us as we tried to do the organizing that would ultimately lead us toward greater understanding of the relationship between the carceral state, issues of sexuality, of racial capitalism, and the destruction of environment. What can poems do? What's poetry have to do with politics? I think that's a pretty illuminating example.
I'm so glad that you read that part for many reasons. One of them is that it's a quintessential example of why I love Angela Davis as a human being so much, because even in that, she's willing to step back and see what she would do differently. There's a self critical humility in her that uh, that she carries everywhere she is, right? And then I would say also about that passage that whatever it takes to move people's hearts, to open their hearts, and poems can work their way into crevices and find their way under barbed wire, and that rhetoric cannot. But I know you're going to turn this to questions for the audience. When you asked me to think about legacy, I want to talk about your legacy some, because when I was reading the Dana Williams, Tony at Random, the iconic writer's legendary editorship, I thought about you, Maya, so much. I'll give you some reasons. Toni Morrison knew how to anticipate what the world needed in terms of books. And she went after people who she knew the world needed to hear. So when she worked with Muhammad Ali, when she worked with James Baldwin, her work with Angela Davis, right? She, with Gail Jones, and you do that as well. You are anticipating what the world needs. And I'm also thinking about Toni Morrison as someone who understood editing as a way of living. So with this book, yeah, you started with it and then you've been carrying it through. This is an example of unalienated labor, right? It's not just let's get this to the copy editor. Let's then find out what Becky's worrying about for the next step. Let's be sure to set up a gig in Atlanta so that we can have this conversation. Let's check on that awareness. I'm thinking about when Toni Morrison and Angela Davis spent 2 weeks together, because that it's about relationship building, and you're doing that. And then I'm thinking about, there was a reference in the Williams book about Morrison helped get the Black Book out into the world, because it couldn't be 800 pages. And you knew this could not be 800 pages. So for me, I want to celebrate the legacy that you are carrying with Toni Morrison. And as someone who actually got to be in the same department with her for a year at Princeton, I can say you're living the good life that Toni Morrison was also living.
Beautiful thing to hear. Thank you.
Yeah.
I,
And this is her book.
That's my
Just so you...
All the Blood Involved in Love. Thank you. There are not a lot of opportunities to see your work reflected back. And so I will honor and accept this one. I am intentionally shaping the work that I do on Toni Morrison's legacy, because in no small way she was writing to and for me and women like me. And I have an enviable position. The world of editing is shrinking. The AI era is present. The state of the nation is leaning toward fascism, and that means that people are reading less. And so my responsibility is to make sure things don't get lost.
Right.
My responsibility is to make sure that models that are replicable and that are passable from voice to voice and person to person are present and documented and easy to carry.
Yeah.
And so I think that's actually an argument for continuing to publish anthologies, particularly this kind of book as a reunion of June, who was right a long time ago and who remains right, and who is being pulled from the sort of dark recesses of the stage back into the spotlight because she remains relevant. And because I am good at being a hub, I am being a hub. So thank you.
So let's hear questions, ideas, comments, insights.
Yeah.
Our virtual audience, but folks, put them in the chat if you have any.
Don't be shy.
And Abeo, you're welcome to send questions as well, as are you. Or anything that you want to hear more about, anything that just came to mind. Comments are also welcome. I may not ever say that on a stage again, but say it now.
I'd be interested to know if y'all were to encounter someone who wasn't familiar with June Jordan or her work. Is there a poem that you would recommend, like as a starting place, as an introduction?
A poem about my rights. Absolutely. If you have not read or listened to that poem, I would ask you to go find a video of it right now.
And that's one of the only ones that where we can hear her voice. And one of the many times in this volume, and also with meeting the people who are in this volume, talk about is her voice. There was a sincerity and a giggle and an intelligence that she carried in the resonance of her voice that you can hear in that poem. You know, June Jordan, I'm thinking about Soldier, which was her last book, her memoir about growing up. And it was the last conversation I had with her as well when she came to Jamaica Plain and did a reading. And we talked afterwards, and she said that Soldier was the hardest book of all the ones that she did. But she did 30 some odd books, right? And because after writing 250 pages, she had to throw those out and start over. And I thought, oh, the strength of that, the rigor of that, right? But because she wanted to get that child's voice. And she was getting that child's voice to be able to speak about what it meant to be abused by her father, who she also dedicates the book to. So we see the complexity of love in that, in that motion. So I would say listening to her read poem about my rights and why she kept the part about her father in that poem, about when he didn't feel comfortable being on any elite campus where she was teaching and or where she was a student, right? The complexity of that, being raised by Caribbean parents and coming, all of that, I'd say Soldier. And then I would say on-call political essays as the location. And then anything by Sweet Honey in the Rock that uses her words, right? Someone come and got to give me a 7-day kiss is June Jordan words. We all, every one of us, there's a lot of there's 8 songs that Sweet Honey did that are June Jordan words.
That's community work. I would add, as a good starting place, Haruku love poems. It's the kind of book you keep in your back pocket and read a little bit every day, or put next to your bed night, your nightstand. And it speaks to romantic love, but also spiritual love. I'd say if you want a primer, The Essential June Jordan is a good, useful book. But I think if I were to reintroduce myself to June Jordan, I would start with one collection of essays, and it would be On Call. And then I would use one book of poems, and that would be Haruku love poems.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
I really love Poem About My Rights, but I haven't heard it in her voice. I haven't heard her read it, so I have to find that.
I hope you will. And if there are no other questions, then I might hand it to Becky to find language to land on. And thank you all for your evening.
Well, I guess I would want to land on one of the poems in this book that by Gwendolyn Hardwick called Call and Response, because June was a poet and a teacher and a scholar and an organizer in the ways that she went about living. So here we go. Call and Response, Gwendolyn Hardwick. Call. 1. It could be a late afternoon. Sometimes dinner is barely on the plate, or we be snuggling, watching TV, maybe in the wee hour of the morning, bodies entwined, clinging to sleep and each other. The phone rings. My lover answers the phone. It's June, she says. We gotta go. 2. Be prepared. 3. Grab revolutionary necessities. Sneakers, check. Loose clothing, check. Bandana, check. Small first aid pack, check. Make signs, practice chants. A people united will never be defeated. No justice, no peace. What do we want? When do we want it? Response. Reject, refute, resist. Tendencies to be silent, passive, tentative, victimized. Fight back, fight against, fight to end mass incarceration, mass murders, children in cages, hunger, food insecurity, homelessness, joblessness, water, air, land pollution. Take the law into your hands, into the streets, into the courts. Form a squad.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Bale.
Thank you for having us here. So appreciate it.